listening to I Am Refocused Radio with your host, Shamaya Reed. This show is designed to inspire you to live your purpose and regain your focus. And now, here's your host, Shamaya Reed.
Hey, welcome to I Am Refocused Radio. We are here once again, and just like any other day, we have another awesome show line for y'all. Today, we have a special guest, Will McLean Greeley. He is the author of A Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington. You can go to his website right now. It's real simple, willgreeley.com. He's going to tell us everything about his book. So without further ado, I just want to welcome you to the show, Will. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your show. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you for taking time, man. Tell us a little bit about this book, A Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington.
Yeah, well, this is a biography of Senator George P. McLean from Connecticut. His crowning achievement was overseeing passage of what's called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. Now, this is still in effect today, this legislation. It protects birds from being hunted. There was a big problem with birds being hunted leading up to this treaty that was passed in 1918. So obviously bird lovers will be interested in this book because it really was a turning point in the way not only the United States but the world viewed birds and stopped this excessive hunting. But even if you're not a bird lover, it has far-reaching implications. It was the first time the federal government took on this watchdog role of overseeing our environment. It was a forerunner for future legislation like the Endangered Species Act, the Environmental Protection Act. In other words, there was a states' rights argument that it finally resolved. States were free to set their own hunting laws for birds, their own hunting laws for many areas of conservation. But after this legislation, the federal government took on this expansive role of regulating the environment. And so it really was an essential turning point in how we treat the environment here in the United States and around the world.
When it comes to McLean, when it comes to him and birds, that's the million-dollar question. What made him care about birds so much?
He grew up on a subsistence farm in rural Connecticut in the 1860s and 70s. Imagine what a beautiful area that was, just teeming with wildlife. And as he got older, he noticed sharp declines in the population of many common birds. I believe many people know about the extinction of the passenger pigeon. It was at one time North America's most abundant bird, some 3 to 5 billion. That's with a B. But by 1914, it went extinct, as did a number of other birds in the United States. We used to have an endemic parrot in the United States called the Carolina parakeet. That too went extinct, as did others. And many others were on the verge of extinction, like the snowy egret, the wood duck, the flamingo, trumpeter swan. And there was several reasons for this overhunting. There was hunting for food. As the population grew after the Civil War, people hunted birds as a food source. But it also became fashionable to wear feathers on hats, women's clothing primarily. And so there was a great demand for hunting birds, and McLean noticed a tremendous decline in bird populations. But here's the problem. Every state was free to set its own hunting laws, and many states had lax laws that they never really enforced. Here's an example. The state of Missouri had one hunting law in the late 1800s, and that was you couldn't hunt on Sunday. But otherwise, you could hunt whatever you wanted, however much, whatever time of year. And so spring hunting became very popular for millionaire hunters to go to Missouri and Arkansas and other areas around the country to hunt birds in the spring while they were nesting. And if you want to have birds go extinct, kill them while they're on their nests. And that's what was happening. So McLean was a nature lover as a young man. He was also a hunter, but he renounced hunting because he saw these declines in bird populations. And many other people were alarmed at this fast track to extinction. And so he was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1911, and his maiden speech in the Senate was on the topic of federal protection for birds.
When it comes to his history and how he has played a significant role in our U.S. history, why is it so important for people to not just read about his personal story, but also appreciate his efforts when it comes to wildlife?
Yeah, that's a great question, because this had far-reaching implications. I think all of us can celebrate the resurgence of the bald eagle. That's an example of how federal protection for birds plays out in real life. In 1963, in the United States, we had, it's estimated, about 400 nesting pairs of bald eagles left in the United States. Just 400 nesting pairs. There was a sense that bald eagles, our national symbol, were on the fast track to extinction, probable extinction it was called. Well, the federal government got engaged through the Fish and Wildlife Service, and many groups came together to see to it that the bald eagle would survive. In 2019, Shemaya, the most recent data I have, there were over 70,000 pairs of bald eagles now in the United States. There's an estimated 380,000 bald eagles in the U.S., including Alaska. To me, that's exciting. That's really an achievement that is the result of this legislation that McLean and others fought for, because there was tremendous opposition to federal oversight over the environment. It was a 7-year struggle in the Senate. And I think what's also notable is that this was a bipartisan achievement. Now, here's something that's relevant to today. McLean put together a bipartisan coalition to stop the states' rights advocates who had been fighting federal legislation for decades. And he ensured this through an unlikely partnership with then President Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat. McLean was a Republican. But the two came together to assure the passage of this legislation despite decades of opposition. And they did this while we were fighting World War I. And there was a global flu pandemic. So it was a significant achievement. And the more you know about the struggle that they went through to get this passed, the more you'll appreciate things like the resurgence of the bald eagle, because there was a time where the states could do whatever they wanted, and this was a test case to get the federal government involved in overseeing, taking on this watchdog role of the environment that we all take for granted today.
When people read this book, you have a lot of positive response from people already on popular platforms like Amazon. Why should people really just be open-minded to the whole topic of wildlife and environment? Because sometimes in this political space, it can be very, negative.
Yeah. Well, there's an expression that history repeats itself. And usually we think of that in a negative way. But I believe that history can repeat itself in a positive way. And this is what I mean. McLean grew up at the end of the Civil War, and that was the most polarized time in American history, far worse than today. And I know it's hard to relate to the idea of the Civil War, but McLean and others came a generation or two after the Civil War, and they wanted to bring this country back together again and focus on solving problems that confronted the American people. And I believe that we can still do that. It might not happen overnight, but I know my kids, they're in their 20s. They're looking at the gridlock and the polarization today, and they can't relate to our leaders. But I'm hopeful that in our next generation is going to be like the Senator McLean, in the sense that they're going to move beyond polarization and focus on solving problems that matter to the American people. And so my hope is that history will repeat itself, and there will be this time of bipartisan cooperation to solve pressing problems and get away from the polarization that we are experiencing now and the country experienced once before during the American Civil War.
When it comes to Senator McLean's story, what part of it do you find so important that us readers can appreciate those lessons, life lessons that we can apply to our very own?
Yeah. Well, he was 61 years old in 1918 when this legislation passed. And there were many life experiences that he had that I document in the book that led up to this time in the U.S. Senate. He had many setbacks. He was a reformed governor of Connecticut in his 40s. He wanted to be president of the United States. And all of his reforms as governor were blocked by the leaders of his own party. And he was pretty much shunned by his political leaders. And he spent almost 8 years regrouping after his unsuccessful time as governor. He could have left politics altogether and done something else. He was a wealthy man. He was a lawyer, and he had many options. But I think on one level, this is an inspiring story of how somebody didn't quit. They persevered. They had a passion to do something about the environment that really mattered to McLean. And he persevered. And he went on. Instead of living the good life with the wealth he had, he wanted to live a better life. And he went back into politics. And he was very devoted to oversee this federal legislation that is still in effect today. It's our major bulwark against protecting birds and wildlife more broadly. And so it's an inspiring story of making a comeback, not quitting, not settling for an easy life, but pursuing your passion, your dream, and moving on in a different way. In his 60s in the Senate, did make this goal of being president of the United States, but he did take his gifts and talents and adversity that he learned from and applied it in a very constructive way later in his life.
We're talking to our guest, Will Greeley, and you can go to his website, is willgreeley.com. We're discussing his book, A Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington, Senator George P. McLean, Birdman of the Senate. You mentioned how important history really is, and I like how you tied it together with what's going on currently in the political realm, and it's like very cut and dry. People feel one way, and then other people feel the other way. What's some of the lessons learned from George that we can focus on in today's world to kind of meet the middle ground versus being the exact opposite of opinion?
Right. He was somebody that did search for the middle ground. And I think there were many life lessons that he learned in his 30s, 40s, and 50s that he applied when he got into the Senate in his 60s. He learned that, leading change is never easy. I think all of us who are confronted with trying to lead change have to accept that reality that it's not popular to try to lead change. And it takes a special kind of person to lead change. Dictators don't work, bullies don't work. And there are many life lessons that he learned that I document in my book that made him an effective leader of change. First, he knew how to communicate urgency and a vision. His maiden speech in the Senate was on bird protection, and he persevered over a 7-year time period to get this vision implemented. Secondly, he knew how to overcome obstacles and show flexibility and adaptability. The legislation morphed and changed to meet the legitimate objections of people who opposed him. But most important, he knew how to build coalitions. Change starts small, but ultimately it needs critical mass to be successful. And the way he formed these coalitions across party lines, working with President Woodrow Wilson, as I said, who was a Democrat, and he was a Republican. These are life lessons for all of us in terms of how to be successful change agents, building coalitions. And so I think for those of you who are in a position of trying to lead change, this can help inspire you to see how one person did it. And it's an inspiring story that you can take into your own life if you're in a position of leadership where you have to be a change agent.
You had a deep interest when it comes to American history and politics and birds. So when it comes to this project, putting this book together, why was it so important for you to complete this one? So that way we all have the true honor to appreciate it.
Yeah, well, when I was in college, I wanted to get a PhD in history and teach history. I got as far as a master's degree and had a lot of student loans. And I said, well, I'm just going to go into the workforce and start paying off these loans and then go back. Well, life got in the way. I got a career in market research that I loved, and I never did go back. But I retired from my career about 3 years ago. And so this is in some ways coming full circle to go back to that first love of American history and trying to learn from the past. There's one other element, Shemaya, and this is my great uncle. My middle name is McLean, and I grew up not knowing much about this individual. And people in my family had sort of relegated him to a critical view. He opposed the League of Nations, which was the forerunner of the United Nations. And because of that stance, like my uncles and aunts and my dad, they did not like this man. And he was a Republican in this era of like the Theodore Roosevelt Republicans. And they took a different path. They loved Franklin Delano Roosevelt as Democrats. And so my dad and others in my family had a special dislike of this man because he wasn't like them. He was a Republican. And so there was a lot lost in family history of understanding who this man was. And so I wanted to learn for myself his life story, to see his strengths and his weaknesses. We're all multifaceted. There were some stances like the League of Nations that maybe I didn't agree with, but overall his contribution to American history was positive because of this Migratory Bird Treaty Act. But he knew 5 presidents very well. He advised them in the White House. He was in the Senate for 18 years, and he weighed in on many key issues confronting the country from 1911 to 1929. The First World War, the Federal Reserve Bank. He voted on 3 constitutional amendments, the 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendment. And he had an influential role in many of these key issues over a 20-year period in our history. So I just wanted to learn his life story, the arc of it, to see how this Migratory Bird Treaty Act fit into it. And it was very enriching for me to see the totality of his life and the struggles that he went through that prepared and equipped him for his major achievement of passing this Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918.
And the key thing you said there was his struggles that led to his achievements, because he was a powerhouse. He was serving in his legislature, Connecticut, governor, U.S. attorney, and U.S. senator. Those tasks are very important tasks. It's not something to take lightly, and it takes a noble person to sign up for that, job. So that said, you did that with this book and sharing the history of the individual. What would you say to our audience as far as the importance of not just showing up for the task, but understanding the impact it can have?
Mm-hmm. I think looking at adversity in our lives as not a negative, but as a way that's going to prepare and equip us for challenges ahead, to learn from your struggles. He had many failures as governor. He tried to push through a very ambitious reform agenda that was flat rejected by the legislature and many people in his state. But he learned from his failures. He learned from his disappointments. And I think that's something that we all can take away from this book is when we are faced with setbacks, disappointments, what can we learn from that? How can we grow from that? What is it that these experiences are preparing and equipping us for, instead of just quitting and getting bitter? And I think that's something that you can see in this man's life is the setbacks he had eventually prepared him for his greatest achievement, which happened when he was 61 years old. So I think that's an inspiring story for many of us. Because life is filled with disappointment, it's filled with adversity. And I think it's very important how we react to that, looking at those experiences as learning times and being hopeful and optimistic that there will be a better future as long as we learn from the past and not get discouraged by it.
I believe sometimes in America history and politics in general, we can get so caught up with the presidents that the other names are forgotten. Why was it so important? I know you kind of said it, but I want to emphasize it, have you emphasize it for our listeners. Why was it so important for this guy's story to be shared with the world? Because we sometimes forget it's not just presidents that are doing jobs, it's the ones beneath.
Yeah, I think we have a tendency to elevate the presidency over everyone else and diminish the contributions that the Congress has, that the judges have. This was an interrelationship between the Congress and the presidency. And many times meaningful change comes about from those who are forgotten, like senators, governors. And yet there's a lot that you learn about the presidency from the perspective of the Congress. And as I said, he interacted with 5 U.S. presidents. So you will learn about the presidency, but I think we tend to elevate the importance of the presidency over other people who really contribute to grassroots change. A president's not going to come in and say, we have to protect birds. Their concerns are more about national security and top issues of the day. But it's someone in the Senate that can elevate this kind of issue to the attention of the nation and bring others on board to see the importance of it. So I agree with what you're saying, Shemaya, is that we can't just look at U.S. history through the eyes of the presidents. We have to look at the contributions of other people who interact with our presidents, other people who create grassroots change and put pressure on leaders to see through important change that has long-term benefit for our country.
We're talking to our guest, Will Greeley, and his book, A Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington, Senator George P. McLean, Birdman of the Senate. You can get this anywhere you get a book. You can go directly to his website. His website, once again, is willgreeley.com. As time is winding up for us, you being able to live part of the American dream. You have a story as well. What would you say sticks out for you when you look at the successes you were able to obtain in your own lifetime?
Well, I've often thought if I could go back in time and meet this individual, what would I say to him? In many ways, it would be thank you for what he did, for not cashing out after he left the governor's office. As I said, he was a fairly wealthy man. And there must have been some temptation for him to say, the leaders of my own party have rejected me. They won't support my run for the Senate. Why don't I just live the good life? The Jay Gatsby lifestyle of the 1920s, sort of a decadent lifestyle of just spending money on yourself. And I would say thank you to him for not choosing that option. I write in my book that instead of living the good life, he set out to lead a better life. And so I would thank him for that, for not just turning his back on leading change and living a self-indulgent lifestyle, but to go back into public service and fulfill this ambition he had to save birds. And so that would be the main thing I'd like to say to him was thank you for doing that. And I think I've internalized it in my own life that I try to be truthful to my values and in the place of where I'm at to push for change and to push for making a difference and doing good things for other people and not just living for myself. And I think those are values that he passed along to me and that I hope to pass along to my kids and grandkids. And those are life lessons that I think all of us can benefit from.
Once again, talking to our guest, Will Greeley. You can go to his website, willgreeley.com, and you can go check out this book and get it right now. Goodreads, you can get it on Amazon, you can get it on Writ Press, you can get it right now. A Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington, Senator George P. McLean, Birdman of the Senate. Once again, I want to say thank you to you, Will, for your time.
Thank you very much, Amaya. You've been a great host, and I appreciate your interest in this topic and letting me reach out to your listeners about it. So thanks very much again.